When Mehdi Hasan breaks his silence on Islam, people pay attention, and not just because he is a journalist known for sharp debates and fearless interviews, but because he has built a reputation on asking difficult questions and refusing to back down when the topic becomes uncomfortable. For years, critics and supporters alike have tried to define him. Some call him a defender of faith, others label him controversial. But what happens when he steps away from the political battlefield and speaks personally about Islam itself? That is where the real story begins. The moment was not filled with dramatic music or a staged audience. It was calm, deliberate, and powerful. He did not raise his voice. He did not attack anyone. Instead, he spoke with clarity about what Islam means to him in a world where the religion is often misunderstood, misrepresented, and politicized. He explained that Islam at its core is not a slogan, not a headline, and certainly not the violent caricature often portrayed in certain media spaces. For him, Islam is discipline, spirituality, accountability, and justice. He emphasized that growing up as a Muslim in the West meant constantly balancing identity with perception, faith with public scrutiny, and belief with bias. He described how, after major global events, Muslims often find themselves forced into defensive positions, repeatedly asked to explain crimes they did not commit, ideologies they do not follow, and extremism they do not represent. What shocked many viewers was not anger or outrage, but his honesty about the exhaustion that comes from constantly having to prove your humanity. He said that Islam taught him principles long before he ever stepped into a newsroom. Truthfulness, standing up against injustice even if it is against yourself, and caring for the oppressed. These were not political lessons, he argued, but spiritual ones. He pointed out that the Quranic message emphasizes mercy over hatred and justice over chaos, yet those aspects rarely dominate mainstream discussions. Instead, the loudest and most extreme voices are often amplified, creating a distorted image that millions accept without question. He acknowledged that there are real problems within Muslim communities. No community is perfect, but he challenged the idea that Islam itself is the problem. According to him, confusing the actions of individuals with the teachings of a faith followed by nearly 2 billion people is intellectually dishonest. What truly stunned his audience was when he said that his faith does not weaken his journalism. It strengthens it. He rejected the assumption that being Muslim compromises objectivity. On the contrary, he argued that his belief in accountability before God pushes him to question power more aggressively, not less. Whether interviewing politicians, challenging policymakers, or debating critics, he sees his work as aligned with the Islamic principle of speaking truth to power. He also addressed the internal struggles many young Muslims face today, feeling pressured to dilute their identity in order to fit in. He admitted there were moments in his own life when he felt the weight of stereotypes and the temptation to stay silent about his faith to avoid backlash. But ultimately, he chose openness over fear. He made it clear that silence allows misinformation to grow unchecked. Breaking that silence, even when uncomfortable, is necessary. He reminded viewers that Islam's history is not one of isolation, but of scholarship, science, philosophy, and coexistence. From classical scholars to diverse global cultures, the Muslim world has contributed richly to human civilization. Yet these narratives rarely make headlines. Instead, a single violent act dominates cycles for weeks, reinforcing fear. He challenged audiences to ask themselves why positive stories are often dismissed as exceptions while negative ones are treated as proof. Perhaps the most powerful part of his statement was when he said that Islam is not something he performs for the camera. It is something he practices in private moments, through prayer, reflection, charity, and self-correction. Thus, faith, he insisted, is not about public display but internal transformation. He acknowledged disagreement exists within Islam as it does in any global religion. But diversity of thought does not equal weakness. It reflects intellectual tradition. He also spoke about Islamophobia, carefully distinguishing between legitimate criticism of ideas and bigotry directed at people. Criticism, he said, is fair game in a free society. Dehumanization is not. That line drew strong reactions because it reframed the conversation away from emotion and toward principle. By the end of his remarks, it became clear why the moment resonated so deeply. He was not trying to convert anyone, nor was he demanding sympathy. He was asking for fairness, nuance, and intellectual honesty. His silence, once interpreted by some as strategic avoidance, turned out to be patience. And when he finally spoke, it was measured, thoughtful, and unapologetic. What shocked everyone was not a scandal or a dramatic revelation, but the calm confidence of someone comfortable in both his faith and his profession. In an era dominated by loud extremes, that quiet conviction felt revolutionary. As Mehdi Hasan continued, the conversation moved from identity to responsibility, and this is where his words became even more compelling. Because instead of focusing only on how Islam is misunderstood by others, he turned inward and spoke about the responsibility Muslims carry in representing their faith with integrity, knowledge, and character. He made it clear that defending Islam does not mean pretending Muslims are flawless or immune from criticism. Rather, it means being honest about internal challenges while refusing to accept collective blame for the actions of a few. He explained that one of the biggest problems facing modern discourse is the collapse of nuance, where complex theological, historical, and political issues are reduced to viral clips and inflammatory headlines. In that environment, Islam often becomes a convenient target, either weaponized by extremists who claim to act in its name, or mischaracterized by critics who judge it solely by its worst examples. What shocked many listeners was his refusal to adopt a defensive tone. Instead, he spoke with intellectual confidence, emphasizing that Islam has a long tradition of debate, scholarship, and critical thinking. He reminded viewers that disagreement within the Muslim world is not new. From early theological discussions to diverse schools of jurisprudence, debate has always been part of Islamic civilization. The idea that Islam cannot withstand scrutiny, he argued, is itself rooted in ignorance. He welcomed questions about faith, law, and ethics, but insisted those questions must be asked sincerely, not as rhetorical traps designed to provoke outrage. He also addressed the double standards that often shape public conversations, pointing out how crimes committed by individuals from certain backgrounds are rarely attributed to their entire religion, while crimes committed by someone identifying as Muslim are immediately framed as inherently Islamic. This inconsistency, he suggested, reveals more about societal bias than about theology. Yet he did not allow the discussion to become purely external. He challenged Muslims to confront cultural practices that are wrongly justified as religious obligations. He emphasized that culture and religion are not identical and infusing the two can lead to injustice being defended in the name of faith. According to him, Islam's foundational texts emphasize justice, mercy, and human dignity, and any interpretation that strips away those principles should be re-examined. He spoke about the importance of education, urging young Muslims to study their faith deeply rather than relying solely on social media snippets or charismatic personalities. As a shallow understanding, he warned, makes communities vulnerable to manipulation from both extremists and opportunists. He reflected on how, in his own journey, learning the historical context of Islamic teachings strengthened his conviction rather than weakening it, because it revealed a tradition far more intellectually rich than stereotypes suggest. At one point, he addressed the accusation that Muslims in Western societies cannot fully integrate while remaining true to their faith. He rejected this outright, explaining that Islam's ethical framework, honesty, charity, service, respect for neighbors, is not in conflict with democratic values, but often complements them. He cited the Quranic emphasis on justice as a universal principle, not a tribal one, and argued that Muslims can be deeply committed citizens while remaining devoted believers. The most striking moment came when he spoke about fear, both the fear some non-Muslims feel toward Islam and the fear some Muslims feel about expressing their identity openly. He acknowledged that fear is powerful and politically exploitable, but he insisted that it cannot be the foundation of a healthy society. Dialogue, education, and genuine human interaction, he argued, are the only sustainable antidotes. He shared personal experiences of debates where hostility transformed into mutual respect once people realized they were engaging with a human being rather than a caricature. That, he said, is why breaking silence matters. Silence allows stereotypes to harden, while speech, when thoughtful and principled, can soften them. He also made it clear that being Muslim does not mean avoiding criticism of Muslim-majority governments or leaders. In fact, he argued that faith demands holding power accountable wherever it exists. Justice is not selective. It is not reserved for one group over another. This position surprised some who expected a purely defensive speech. Instead, they heard a call for consistency. Criticize injustice everywhere, whether it comes from Western capitals or Muslim-majority societies. As he neared the end of this segment, his message crystallized into something broader than religion alone. It became about intellectual honesty in an age of outrage, about refusing to reduce billions of people to a single narrative, and about reclaiming complexity in a world addicted to simplicity. He did not ask for agreement on theology. He did not demand admiration. He asked for fairness, depth, and the courage to move beyond slogans. And perhaps that was what truly shocked everyone. Not that he defended Islam, but that he did so without anger, without theatrics, and without apology, presenting it not as a fragile belief in need of protection, but as a faith confident enough to withstand scrutiny and strong enough to inspire moral responsibility in a chaotic world. By the time Mehdi Hasan reached the final part of his remarks, the tone shifted from explanation to reflection. And what truly left people stunned was not a dramatic revelation, but the deeply personal clarity with which he described his relationship with Islam in a world that constantly demands labels, sides, and simplified identities. He spoke about growing older in the public eye and realizing that silence can sometimes be misinterpreted as uncertainty, fear, or even shame, when in reality it can simply be patience, He decision to wait for the right moment to speak thoughtfully rather than react emotionally. He explained that for years he focused on journalism, debates, and political accountability, believing his work alone demonstrated his values. But eventually he recognized that avoiding open conversations about faith allowed others to define it for him. That realization, he said, is what led him to finally break his silence in a direct and unapologetic way. He described Islam not as a political banner or cultural trend, but as a daily discipline that shapes private behavior more than public rhetoric. Waking up before dawn for prayer, practicing restraint when anger is easier, giving charity quietly without expecting recognition, and constantly evaluating one's own intentions. Those unseen acts, he argued, are the real measure of faith, not viral speeches or trending debates. What surprised many viewers was his admission that faith is not static. It requires constant renewal, learning, and self-critique. He spoke about moments of doubt and questioning, emphasizing that asking hard questions does not weaken belief, but can refine it when approached sincerely. In fact, he suggested that the Islamic intellectual tradition has historically encouraged inquiry, reasoning, and reflection, and that rediscovering that spirit is essential for modern Muslims navigating a hyper-connected world. He turned to the younger generation specifically, acknowledging that many feel trapped between extremes, pressured on one side by voices demanding total assimilation, and on the other by voices demanding rigid uniformity. He encouraged them to resist both pressures and instead ground themselves in knowledge, character, and spiritual sincerity. Islam, he said, is not meant to be lived defensively or aggressively, but confidently and compassionately. He addressed critics directly as well, stating that disagreement with Islamic teachings is part of living in a pluralistic society and does not automatically equal hatred, but reducing Muslims to security threats or cultural outsiders crosses a moral line. He challenged media institutions, political leaders, and influencers to elevate conversations rather than exploit fears for clicks and votes. Yet, even in that challenge, his tone remained measured. He was not calling for censorship or special treatment. He was calling for intellectual consistency and ethical standards applied equally to all. One of the most powerful moments came when he described standing in prayer shoulder to shoulder with people of different ethnicities, languages, and economic backgrounds, all united by a shared act of worship. That image, he said, reminds him that Islam at its core transcends race and nationality, something the modern world still struggles to achieve. It teaches humility, Placing one's forehead on the ground in submission to God is a reminder that no journalist, politician, or critic is above accountability. He explained that this sense of accountability influences how he approaches his professional life, challenging misinformation, questioning authority, and refusing to let narratives go unexamined. Faith, in his view, is not separate from public responsibility, it fuels it. As he concluded, he made it clear that breaking his silence was not about winning an argument or silencing critics, but about reclaiming his own narrative. Islam, he insisted, does not need to be rebranded or softened to be acceptable. It needs to be understood in its fullness, its emphasis on mercy, justice, discipline, and spiritual growth. He acknowledged that not everyone would agree with him, and he was at peace with that. Agreement is not the goal. Understanding is. What ultimately shocked everyone was the calm certainty with which he ended his message, reminding listeners that in an age obsessed with outrage, the most radical act can be steady conviction without hostility. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply articulated a faith that shapes his conscience and his courage, leaving the audience not with a scandalous headline, but with a deeper, more nuanced perspective on Islam and on the man who chose, finally and firmly, to speak.